The conflict between the United States and Iran is not a sudden or isolated problem. It is the product of decades of political hostility, strategic competition, economic pressure, and unresolved historical grievances. Each new crisis appears to the public as an unexpected emergency, yet in reality it follows a familiar pattern that has repeated itself again and again. Sanctions are imposed, military assets are moved closer to regional borders, political leaders issue strong statements, and media coverage intensifies. This cycle creates an environment where confrontation becomes routine and tension becomes normalized. What makes this cycle especially dangerous is how easily it feeds on itself. One side responds to perceived threats with displays of power, while the other interprets those actions as aggression and reacts in kind. Over time, mutual suspicion replaces dialogue. Instead of addressing root causes such as regional security concerns, economic instability, and diplomatic breakdowns, both sides often rely on short term strategies designed to appear strong to domestic audiences. These strategies may generate political support at home, but they increase the risk of escalation abroad. Another key element of this cycle is the use of economic sanctions as a primary tool of pressure. While sanctions are often presented as peaceful alternatives to war, they can deepen hostility rather than reduce it. Economic pressure affects ordinary people first, increasing inflation, unemployment, and social hardship. These consequences can strengthen nationalist narratives and hardline positions within affected countries, making compromise politically costly. Rather than encouraging cooperation, sanctions frequently harden divisions and reinforce the idea that confrontation is unavoidable. Military posturing also plays a central role in sustaining this cycle of tension. The deployment of warships, missile systems, and regional bases sends powerful signals, but it also increases the likelihood of accidents or misinterpretations. When armed forces operate in close proximity, even routine movements can be perceived as preparation for attack. This constant state of readiness keeps both sides locked into defensive and offensive calculations that leave little room for calm strategic thinking. Media coverage further amplifies this recurring pattern. Complex geopolitical issues are often reduced to dramatic headlines and simplified narratives. Public attention focuses on moments of crisis rather than the long term processes that create them. This approach encourages emotional reactions instead of critical analysis. As a result, citizens are frequently exposed to fear based messaging that frames the conflict as inevitable or necessary rather than as a problem that can be addressed through sustained diplomacy. Domestic politics in both countries also reinforce the cycle. Leaders face pressure to appear decisive and powerful, especially during periods of economic or social instability. Taking a hard stance against an external rival can serve as a tool for unifying supporters and diverting attention from internal challenges. Over time, this political strategy becomes embedded in institutional behavior, shaping policy decisions even when alternative approaches might offer more stability. The repeated escalation between the United States and Iran demonstrates how unresolved conflicts can become self perpetuating systems. Instead of moving toward de escalation and long term solutions, each confrontation adds another layer of mistrust and resentment. The longer this cycle continues, the more difficult it becomes to break, as both sides grow accustomed to operating within an environment of constant tension and strategic rivalry. Modern wars rarely begin with formal declarations or clear announcements. Instead, they often emerge from a series of small triggers, misunderstandings, and rapid reactions that slowly push nations toward open conflict. In a world where military technology operates at high speed and global communication spreads information instantly, the margin for error has become dangerously small. A radar misreading, a misinterpreted military exercise, or an aggressive political statement can set off a chain of events that is difficult to stop once it begins. One of the most serious risks comes from the complexity of modern military systems. Automated defense mechanisms, missile detection networks, and cyber operations are designed to respond within seconds. While these systems are built to protect national security, they also reduce the time available for human judgment and diplomatic intervention. When machines are programmed to react faster than leaders can communicate, the possibility of unintended escalation increases. A technical malfunction or false alarm can quickly be mistaken for an attack, prompting immediate retaliation. Political pressure further intensifies the danger of miscalculation. Leaders are often expected to respond forcefully to any perceived threat. In highly polarized political environments, hesitation can be portrayed as weakness. This creates incentives to act quickly rather than carefully. Decisions made under intense public scrutiny and media attention are more likely to prioritize image over long term stability. The demand for rapid responses leaves little room for quiet diplomacy or behind the scenes negotiation. Regional conflicts also play a major role in triggering larger confrontations. Proxy conflicts, where major powers support opposing sides in smaller wars, create environments where indirect actions can have direct consequences. An attack on an allied group or a strike in a contested region can quickly draw powerful nations into direct confrontation. What begins as a localized incident can expand into a broader conflict as alliances and military commitments come into play. Communication breakdowns add another layer of risk. Diplomatic channels are not always open, reliable, or trusted. When direct communication is limited, governments rely on public statements, intelligence reports, and media coverage to interpret the intentions of their rivals. These sources are often incomplete or influenced by political narratives. Misunderstandings become more likely when leaders lack accurate information or assume hostile intent without verification. The speed of modern news cycles also contributes to escalation. Social media and 24-hour news coverage spread unverified reports and dramatic footage within minutes. Public reaction can pressure governments to respond before facts are fully confirmed. Emotional responses fueled by fear and anger make it harder to slow down decision making processes. Once public opinion hardens, leaders may feel trapped by the expectations they helped create. Historical patterns show that many major conflicts began with events that were not originally intended to start wars. Border incidents, accidental encounters, and isolated attacks have repeatedly escalated into full scale battles. These examples highlight how fragile peace can be when tensions are already high and trust is low. The modern international system, with its advanced weapons and interconnected alliances, makes the consequences of such miscalculations far more severe. Military and corporate interests play a powerful and often overlooked role in shaping modern conflicts. Behind the public language of national security and defense lies a massive economic system built around weapons production, private contracting, and security services. This system generates enormous profits during periods of tension and war, creating financial incentives that do not align with the goal of long term peace. When conflict becomes a business opportunity, stability becomes less attractive to those who benefit from instability. The global arms industry is one of the most profitable sectors in the world. Governments spend billions each year on fighter jets, missiles, surveillance technology, and advanced defense systems. These purchases are often justified by the presence of external threats, real or perceived. As tensions rise between nations, military budgets tend to increase, providing steady revenue for defense contractors. The cycle becomes self reinforcing. Fear leads to spending, spending strengthens industry influence, and industry influence encourages policies that sustain fear. Lobbying and political influence further connect corporate interests to government decision making. Large defense companies invest heavily in shaping public policy through campaign contributions, advisory roles, and close relationships with policymakers. This influence can affect which threats are emphasized, which military programs receive funding, and which diplomatic options are sidelined. When corporations that profit from war gain access to political power, the line between public interest and private profit becomes blurred. Private military contractors add another dimension to this economic structure. These companies provide logistics, security, training, and operational support in conflict zones. While they are often presented as cost effective alternatives to traditional military forces, their presence expands the privatization of war. The longer a conflict continues, the more contracts are renewed and expanded. This creates incentives to maintain ongoing operations rather than pursue rapid resolutions. At the same time, the financial burden of conflict falls disproportionately on ordinary citizens. Military spending is funded through taxes and public debt, reducing resources available for healthcare, education, infrastructure, and social programs. Inflation, energy price increases, and market instability often follow periods of international tension. While corporations and investors may benefit from defense contracts and market speculation, working families face higher living costs and reduced public services. The human cost of war is also deeply connected to this economic imbalance. Soldiers, civilians, and displaced populations pay the price in lives disrupted, communities destroyed, and long term trauma. These costs rarely appear on corporate balance sheets or profit reports. They remain invisible in economic calculations that prioritize growth and revenue over human well being. Media and political narratives frequently avoid discussing these financial dynamics. Public debate tends to focus on national pride, security threats, and geopolitical rivalry rather than the economic structures that profit from conflict. By keeping attention on emotional and ideological arguments, the underlying profit motives remain hidden from public scrutiny. This lack of transparency allows the system to continue operating with minimal accountability. When war becomes integrated into economic planning and political strategy, it stops being viewed as a last resort and begins to resemble a routine policy option. This shift fundamentally changes how governments approach international crises, making aggressive responses more likely and peaceful alternatives easier to ignore. Public opinion plays a central role in shaping how societies respond to international conflict, and fear based narratives are one of the most powerful tools used to influence it. When political leaders and media institutions frame global events in terms of absolute threats and urgent dangers. They create emotional reactions that can override critical thinking. Instead of encouraging citizens to examine complex political realities, these narratives simplify conflicts into dramatic stories of heroes and enemies, making military action appear necessary and justified. The language used in public discourse is carefully chosen to trigger emotional responses. Words such as security, threat, defense, and enemy are repeated until they become part of everyday conversation. Over time, this repetition shapes how people interpret new information. When a crisis emerges, many individuals already view it through a lens of fear and suspicion. This makes it easier for governments to mobilize public support for aggressive policies without facing strong resistance or demands for evidence. Media organizations also play a significant role in reinforcing these narratives. The pressure to attract viewers and generate clicks often leads to sensationalized coverage. Dramatic images, urgent headlines, and emotionally charged commentary dominate news cycles. While this approach increases audience engagement, it reduces space for thoughtful analysis and long term context. Complex diplomatic efforts, historical background, and alternative viewpoints receive far less attention than moments of confrontation and spectacle. Social media has intensified this dynamic by accelerating the spread of emotionally charged content. Short videos, viral posts, and trending hashtags can shape public perception within hours. Misinformation and partial truths spread quickly, often faster than official corrections. As people encounter repeated messages that emphasize danger and hostility, their attitudes harden. This environment makes it more difficult to promote patience, compromise, and diplomatic solutions. Political leaders are aware of the power of public emotion and often use it strategically. During periods of crisis, strong rhetoric can boost approval ratings and rally support. Presenting a foreign rival as a direct threat can unite domestic audiences and divert attention from internal problems such as economic inequality, unemployment, or social unrest. Fear becomes a political resource that can be used to strengthen authority and justify controversial decisions. The consequences of these narratives extend beyond immediate policy choices. When fear becomes the dominant framework through which people understand international relations, it shapes long term attitudes toward other nations and cultures. Stereotypes and generalizations become more common, reducing empathy and increasing hostility. This makes future cooperation more difficult as public trust in diplomatic engagement continues to erode. Education and critical media literacy are often overlooked in discussions about national security, yet they are essential tools for resisting manipulation. When citizens lack the skills to evaluate sources, question narratives, and recognize emotional framing, they become more vulnerable to propaganda. Without informed public engagement, democratic oversight weakens, allowing powerful institutions to operate with less accountability. The repeated use of fear based messaging gradually shifts societal expectations. War and military intervention begin to appear normal, while diplomacy is framed as weakness or delay. This cultural shift does not happen overnight, but it builds slowly through repeated exposure to the same themes and messages. Over time, public resistance to conflict diminishes, making it easier for governments to pursue aggressive strategies without facing widespread opposition. Lasting security cannot be achieved through military dominance alone. While armies and weapons may provide short term deterrence, They do not address the underlying causes of conflict. Real stability depends on diplomacy, international cooperation, economic fairness, and the active participation of informed citizens. Without these elements, societies remain trapped in cycles of confrontation that repeatedly threaten global peace. Diplomacy is often misunderstood as weakness, yet it is one of the most powerful tools available to prevent war. Negotiation allows nations to resolve disputes without resorting to violence and creates channels for communication during moments of crisis. When diplomatic institutions are strengthened and respected, they provide alternatives to escalation. Agreements on arms control, trade, and regional security reduce uncertainty and build trust, making sudden conflict less likely. Citizen awareness plays a critical role in shaping government behavior. In democratic societies, public opinion influences elections, policy decisions, and national priorities. When people remain informed and engaged, they are better equipped to question official narratives and demand transparency. This pressure can discourage reckless decision making and encourage leaders to consider long term consequences rather than short term political gains. An active and educated public serves as a safeguard against policies driven by fear and misinformation. Transparency is another essential component of lasting security. Governments that operate behind closed doors without public oversight are more likely to pursue policies that benefit narrow interests rather than the broader population. Open access to information, independent journalism, and accountable institutions allow citizens to evaluate government actions. When decisions about war, military spending, and foreign policy are subject to public scrutiny, it becomes harder to justify unnecessary escalation. International cooperation also strengthens global stability. Challenges such as climate change, economic inequality, and regional instability cannot be solved by any single nation. Collaborative efforts through international organizations and multilateral agreements create shared responsibility and mutual dependence. These connections reduce incentives for conflict by linking national interests to collective outcomes. Cooperation fosters dialogue, builds networks of trust, and creates frameworks for peaceful problem solving. Economic justice is closely tied to security. Societies marked by extreme inequality and economic hardship are more vulnerable to political instability and radicalization. Investments in education, healthcare, infrastructure, and job creation contribute to social stability and reduce the appeal of conflict driven narratives. When people feel secure in their daily lives, they are less likely to support aggressive foreign policies based on fear and resentment. Young generations have a particularly important role to play in shaping the future of global security. Through education, activism, and digital communication, they have access to tools that previous generations did not. By demanding ethical leadership and sustainable policies, they can influence national and international agendas. Their participation ensures that discussions about war and peace are not limited to political elites, but include diverse perspectives and lived experiences. Building lasting security requires a shift in how societies define strength. Instead of measuring power solely by military capability, strength must be understood as the ability to resolve conflicts peacefully, protect human rights, and promote shared prosperity. This transformation demands patience, commitment, and collective responsibility from governments and citizens alike,